Thanks for joining me on episode 963 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
I'm Travis Rosser, the author of You Inc., the step-by-step guide for finding the business within you. I challenge you to invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, and impact the world by using your time, your talent, and your treasures to live out your calling. Having the ability to really find your gifts and calling is a key. And one way to be inspired to do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast by my friend Scott Mader.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying if you're working two jobs so that you can put a roof over your head and food on your table, you run right out and quit your job so that you can go out and do something that feels better. But what I am saying is until you identify a path towards that, you're going to stay feeling too busy, overwhelmed, and stressed out. But if you identify a path and begin walking down that path, you'll immediately begin to feel better.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in others by stewarding your time, I talk with you about why we feel we never have enough time. I also share why it's as much psychological as based on the clock, and I also give you some tips on what you can do about it.
As we talk about stewarding your time, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without just taking too long? Turns out you can. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show just that quick. If you enjoy the show when you are ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon.
Nowadays, it seems like we look up at the end of the day and it's amazing that the entire day has passed. The day's over and yet we've got nothing done. We're trying to figure out a time to schedule plans with others, and it doesn't seem like there's any time open on the calendar. Most people nowadays feel like we don't have enough time. And I wanted to talk about some of the reasons behind that. First off, there's actually a lot of studies now that show that on average, American workers are working 47, 48, or 50 hours, somewhere in that neighborhood, instead of a 40-hour work week, even though there's a lot of research that shows that over 40 hours tends to be less productive. And in fact, if you look at the spread, many people are spending 70 or more hours every week working, especially if you include their second job or side hustle kind of jobs as well. And this has a couple of distinct effects. First off, you are maybe working more hours than you really need to because you're trying to make yourself seem a little more indispensable to your company, or just because there's a need to be busy. Or sometimes it's even just because you have no other thing to do. You fill up your schedule with lots of busy stuff, not filling up your schedule with lots of important stuff. Another study that's out there shows that there's a lot of extra tasks that we do, and we oftentimes feel pressured about these tasks if they tend to be looked at by us as tedious, repetitive, or uninteresting. When you're doing tasks that you're not really jazzed to do, you end up feeling like you have less time. Stress plays a massive role in how we feel about time. And when we feel like we've got conflicting goals and we're pulled in multiple directions and we're not in alignment, that stress makes us feel like we don't have enough time. And I've talked before about how social media could create that feeling of FOMO, that feeling of I'm always missing out. I want to do something else that I'm not doing right now. A lot of times, too, you're not paying attention to the time that you are actually using and where you're using it. And so you'll spend hours on something simple and repetitive and that's rewarding, like checking Facebook, when you're not actually getting the work done that you need to do. There's also studies that show that when you lack autonomy, when you don't feel like you have any control over your own time, that begins to make you feel more and more out of control. If you feel like you have the ability to make choices about your time, then suddenly you begin to feel more in control. And it's not necessarily saying no to doing something and creating more free time. It's just having the ability to choose when and what you do. The truth is, all of these things can affect you and your time, but notice that many of them don't necessarily actually have anything to do with the number of hours that you work or the amount of time that you put in. The first one that we talked about in terms of 40 hours a week does, but the rest of them all have a psychological component. The fact that we feel overwhelmed and busy and stressed out and not engaged and like we have no autonomy is as much psychological as it is based on the clock. And the truth is, you can do things about that. You can begin to find ways to block out social media. You can begin to find ways to say no to some things so that you can say yes to the most important things. That's what we talk about over and over again on this show, is the way you can do that. By paying attention to where you're spending your time, by focusing in on what your real goals and values are, by doing the deep work, you begin to open up the feeling of having more time and the reality of having more time. Both the clock and your psychology begins to align. Every time I've taken on extra things, even whenever it was something I wanted to do and I thought it was important, if it wasn't in alignment with my overall goals, I end up feeling stressed out, tired, frustrated, and too busy to really do what I'm supposed to do. And every time that happens, I end up feeling like I don't have enough time, even though I oftentimes do. And the truth is, that's the same for you. So the first step and the most important step is always to really sit down with your calendar and your to-do list and your other tasks and figure out, what are my priorities? What are my values? What is really important to me? And what can I do to begin to bring these things into alignment? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying if you're working 2 jobs so that you can put a roof over your head and food on your table, you run right out and quit your job so that you can go out and do something that feels better. But what I am saying is, until you identify a path towards that, you're going to stay feeling too busy, overwhelmed, and stressed out. But if you identify a path and begin walking down that path, you'll immediately begin to feel better. And that's what I teach. That's what we try to do. It's not about living out your calling magically. It's about doing the hard work, doing the deep work, so that you truly can live your life in alignment and do what God calls you to do. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of time, be sure to sign up for our Stewardship of Time Tips series by going to inspiredstewardship.com/time or texting 44222 time tips, and that'll get you our best tips on stewarding your time. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.